Hello, fantasy fiction fans! So this last weekend, I went out to do an Apple Wassail, Wassail, on the 12th night. Well, how was the weekend, the 12th night, you may well ask? And why wassail an apple? Well, actually, it's wassailing an apple tree, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And I'll put some pictures of the wassail that I did onto my show notes, and hopefully a bit of footage too, some video footage. But let's get down to an explanation, first of all, about 12th night. Now, traditionally, 12th night comes at the end of Christmastide. But it's at the start of a new season, and that new season is called Epiphany-tide, and it runs until Candlemas, which is the 2nd of February. And Epiphany is traditionally the time when the Magi, M-A-G-I, or the Three Kings, came to visit Christ the baby. Now, you may or may not know that 12th night, and also it's known as the Epiphany Eve, by the way, is a festival which takes place at the end of the 12 days of Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas from the Christmas song. And in that way, it marks the coming of Epiphany. Now, we know it's been an important church festival in the Christian church since at least the year 567. So this is a very, very, very old festival indeed. But of course, we in Britain and in the West, we tend to think of Christmas Day as being December the 25th. And we tend to think of Christmas Day as being set in stone. So the 12th night, to us anyway, is the 5th or the 6th of January. But presumably, 12th night was not the 5th or 6th of January to William Shakespeare. And it's certainly not 12th night to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Because, and there's a really good reason for this, because Christmas Day, although we think it was set in stone, and it's set in stone as December 25th, is actually January the 7th, according to the Eastern Orthodox churches, and others like, for example, the Amish, who continue to believe that Christmas Day is the January the 7th. That would make the 12th night to be the 17th or the 18th of January, which, as you could quickly work out, was this last weekend. Now, in some rural counties and in some rural communities, like the one I visited in Tilford at the weekend, Old 12th Night is still celebrated on 17th of January, or the first Saturday closest to the 17th of January. Now, this curious date comes about because the Calendar Act of 1750, so that's after William Shakespeare, the Calendar Act of 1750, which is a British Act of Parliament, reformed the old calendar of England and got the whole of the United Kingdom to adopt the new, well, it's not exactly new, but there we are, the new Gregorian calendar that had been introduced across the whole Holy Roman Empire in 1582. This new Gregorian calendar brought in something that's familiar with us, to us now. It's called the leap year idea. And it was especially designed to develop and correct some of the mistakes and some of the slippages that had occurred in the earlier Julian calendar. Now, the Julian calendar, which was proposed by Julius Caesar in year 708, was actually a reformed version of the even earlier Roman calendar, which I talked about at New Year. But don't let that confuse you. Anyway, what I did want to do is that people in the East, and especially people who are adherents of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and other pockets of Protestant religions or puritanical religious points of view, they disliked the idea of the new Gregorian calendar. I say new in scare quotes, by the way, because it was 1582. But they thought it was too Catholic because it was proposed by Pope Gregory and it was used by the Holy Roman Empire. So they attempted to work around the Gregorian calendar and continue to use the Julian calendar for some of their religious festivals. So, for example, for years, the Scottish-Irish settlers in Appalachia continued to celebrate Christmas on January the 6th. And like I've already said, the Mennonites and the Amish, they still do. Anyway, this same kind of stubborn attitude led folks in the rural British communities to do the same kind of thing. So it was commonplace to celebrate Twelfth Night on the 17th or maybe 18th of January. And even today, Old Twelfth Night, so at least we put the word old before it, is celebrated in the southwest of England, so down in Cider Country and Scrumpy Country, on the 17th of January. So the Old Twelfth Night tradition in rural Britain is to include something called an Apple Wassail. So what's wassailing? I've already covered this before in a previous show, but just to remind you, it's about a party, really. So the word wassail comes from an Old English word, which is hal, H-A-L, and it's related to an Anglo-Saxon greeting, which used to be bu hal, H-A-L-E, and it basically means enjoy a party. So I went down to the Apple Wassail in Tilford, and the first thing we did was we grabbed a whole load of pots and pans for our wassailing party, because we wanted to make plenty of noise to scare away any bad spirits and demons that might be following us around. And then we played music and we jigged and we processed around the apple orchard. And during our procession, we drank some cider, which incidentally was very, very strong. And we toasted with actual bread the apple trees that we visited. We wore some green wreaths that we'd made during the day, and we paraded around with those. And we also toasted the youngest tree in the orchard. And if you look at my show notes, you'll see this. And this little tree was given special protection by a visiting druid who said prayers over the little sapling and gave the tree its own protective spirit. We visited the oldest apple tree in the orchard, and the oldest apple tree is often known in the West and in rural communities as Apple Tree Man. And the tradition is that you should offer a cup of your best cider to the Apple Tree Man because he's the oldest tree in the herd, as they call it, and so he protects the other members of the herd. And he'll make sure that the other members of the herd do their duty and give a good crop at harvest time. So we toasted the Apple Tree Man at Tilford, and we decorated his branches and his boughs, and we said thanks to him. And we sang a song, and the song goes, old apple tree, we've come to wassail thee, to bear and to bow apples enow, hats full, caps full, 3 bushel bags full, barn floors full, and a little heap under the stair. The Apple Wassail on Twelfth Night. The founding of Rome. So last week, in the first part of my classical Rome series, I spoke about the people who were there before the Romans. And if you've been watching the excellent Sky and Amazon Prime fantasy fiction series Britannia, you might have wondered who the Canti and the Regni were, or the Regni. So these were 2 of the Iron Age tribes of Britain that lived in the British Isles before the Romans arrived. And like the Villanovans that I chatted about in my last week's show, they were the original natives of the land. Now the Canti lived in Kent, that's in the south of England, to the south of London, and you'll know that Canterbury is in the south of England, and of course Canterbury is named after the Canti tribe. Julius Caesar landed in Cantium-held territory on his first invasion of Britain, and so he considered the tribe to be special because it was the first native tribe that he'd had any contact with, or the Romans had had any contact with. But alongside the Canti lands were the Regni tribes, with their capital at a place that we now call Chichester. And these were kind of the enemy of the Cantis, as you know, if you've been watching Britannia. And Julius Caesar formed a relationship, an alliance with the Regni tribe, and used them as a way of shoehorning his way into Britain. As you know, or possibly you know, he actually left, and then there was a second invasion of Britain by the Romans. And the series Britannia is following that second invasion. Now, I'm sure I'll return to the Iron Age tribes of Britain in a later show because it's a fascinating subject, because those people are the indigenous people of the country. But this week I want to concentrate on the founding of Rome, because this is a series on Rome. Now, I like to think that Rome was built on 3 principles and one great idea. The 3 principles are these: a clever mercantile system which is based on lucrative trade routes set up by the earlier Etruscan civilization that I mentioned last week, and an avaricious expansionist approach to military adventure that brought about a planned assimilationist vision and a popular ideology that was based on centuries-old myth and magic. And what's the great idea, you ask? Well, it's the establishment of a republic in about 509 BC. And the Republic of Rome, and the idea of the Republic of Rome, can be summed up in just 4 letters. That's how clever it is. SPQR, which stands for the Senate and People of Rome. And that was a revolutionary idea. It means that the citizens themselves would govern themselves. And so therefore they would choose their own destiny. There was no king involved pushing them towards a particular fortune. They would be in charge of their own destiny. Now, I know that before you write in and tell me, I know that Romans did have kings and they had emperors and they had dictators, but the original idea, this one great idea, SPQR, is the thing which gives the Roman civilization this motivation and this dynamic drive. Now, we'll look at the first 2 principles in a later show. So we'll look at the mercantile system, and we'll look at the military adventurism. But this week I wanted to concentrate on the myth and magic of Rome, because that's what this show's all about, myth and magic. And I wanted to start with their multiplicity of gods. Now, unless you were raised on the Indian subcontinent, and many of you will have been, or you're a born-again pagan, then it's hard to get your head around a society that not only entertains, but is actually based upon the belief in a multitude of gods. Because here in the West, in the United States of America and in Western Europe and in Great Britain, we are so used to the concept of just one god that a battalion of smaller gods might seem vaguely insane to us. It could also be viewed as profane and sacrilegious to many. But before we go any further, you need to understand that the Romans had many gods, and all of these gods had a purpose. And it's the same, by the way, with magical thinking. Perhaps we might be irrationally superstitious at times. We might think twice, for example, about travelling on Friday the 13th or walking under a ladder, or we might be worried that we've just broken a mirror. But what would it be like? Can you imagine? What would it be like if almost every event and every action that you did or had to do must be formalised by a special spell or by an official offering or something like that to stop the badness? Can you imagine that? Everything you did, you'd have to do a spell or make an offering. The clever thing about all this is that the myth and magic of Rome wasn't just done because people were superstitious. It was done to serve a purpose. The purpose of the myth and magic of Rome was political as well as moral. The myths and the magic of Rome were there to remind people that Rome was their government. They owned it and run it, and yet somehow it was divine because it was connected to gods through magic in a rather special way. Even now, when we speak of Rome, we call it the eternal city, and we don't think much about that phrase. But imagine what it must be like to live in a place that's connected, or even plugged into, if you like, and affiliated with heaven. Rome is affiliated to the supreme beings of heaven. It's like that now, and it was like that then when it started. Imagine Olympians guarded your city gates, and spirits looked after your food, and little gods looked after every little thing in your life. Romans, when they went to pay the rent, or when they went to buy their new clothes, or when they went to fetch some water, they were helped along the way by gods and by spirits. You may have heard of the word Pantheon. A pantheon, Pantheon, is a set of gods that is used by a society. We do not have a pantheon in the West. We don't have one in Great Britain or in Western Europe or United States of America, because we only have one God, and our God is a jealous God and doesn't like lots of other gods. But other societies do have a pantheon of gods. So, for example, you'll know that the Egyptians had more than one god. They had about 50 main gods and another 100 or so minor gods. In fact, according to Egyptologists, they had about 1,500 gods in all. Now, the earliest known Roman pantheon included the following gods. I don't know if this is the correct chart order, but this is how I see it. Number 1, the two-faced god Janus. Now, I talked about him in the first show of the year. He's the god of transitions and doorways, amongst other things. And the reason I spoke about him in my first show of the year is because he gave his name to January. Number 2, Vesta, the virgin goddess of hearth and home. Now, Vesta is considered to be the guardian of the Roman people, so she's very important. And if you saw an image of her, you'd think she was the Virgin Mary. I'll put an image on my show notes so you can see what I'm talking about. In fact, both of these figures seem to share remarkable similarities, but the obvious difference, obviously, is that Mary gave birth to God, whilst Vesta remained a virgin. Number 3 in the chart countdown, Jupiter, the Sky Father and the god of the sky and thunder. Now, Jupiter, and he's also known as Jove, and that's where we get the expression by Jove, is the king of the gods. You would take an oath on Jupiter, much like people swear by Almighty God on the Bible in Western courts these days. Jupiter is also known as the Sky Father, and he's related to the Greek god Zeus and the Egyptian god Horus, talking about Egyptian gods. Horus, by the way, is the one with the falcon's head. So that's interesting that he's known in Native American culture. Jupiter is known as the Sky Father. And if you saw a depiction of Zeus, you'd say, aha, yes, that's God. That's God all right. He's always pictured as having a long beard. He has long hair. He's an old man. He sits on a throne up in the clouds. And he's the god of justice and of good government. And so in that way, he served a secular and a rationalist purpose. Remember I said earlier, they had a political reason to believe in these gods, as well as a non-secular reason. Next in the list is Mars, the god of war. Now, oddly, Mars is also the god of agriculture. And do war and agriculture go together, you might ask? Well, some people think it's because he's connected with iron tools. So, for example, the same blacksmith who perhaps makes a ploughshare or a pitchfork also makes a sword or a breastplate. But it's mainly, actually, because when the season for military campaigning ended in classical Roman times, that's when the season for farming began. So Mars, the god of war, takes the ordinary citizens from a military point of view to a farming point of view. Mars is very similar to the god Ares, but not the same, because Romans thought that Ares was erratic and not a logical strategist, whereas Mars, the god of war, is less erratic and more logical. And finally, in the pantheon of Roman gods is Quirinus. Now, this is Quirinus, and in a weird connection to the apple wassailing. Remember I told you that a druid came and said a prayer over the young sapling? The druid did offer a prayer to Quirinus. Now, he's the god of the Roman state, but he's also the oak god, and he's often portrayed as a bearded man, and it's thought that his divine entity came about when there was a split of the founder of Rome and his godlike other half. So, therefore, Romulus, who's the founder and the mortal founder of Rome, was killed, while Quirinius, the god part of the founder of Rome, lived on forever to protect Rome. Do you see what I'm saying? So that original figure, who was a man, was split in half at his death, and the spirit side of him continued as Quirinius. Now, as you know, because we talked about it in the last show, the Romans were like the Borg in Star Trek. They tended to assimilate the biological and the technological distinctiveness of the races that they vanquished. And through this process of assimilation, they added a whole lot more gods to their original pantheon that I've just outlined. They found that some of these foreign gods were almost the same as their existing gods, in that they shared the same characteristics. So remember I said just now that the god Jupiter is similar to the god Zeus and the god Horus. And that's because when the Romans assimilated Greek and then later Egyptian culture, they just joined the two gods together. But during their assimilation process, they also found that some foreign gods were very distinctive and very unique and very useful from a political as well as religious point of view. So, for example, the god of the river in London is known as Thamesis, Thamesis, and they preserved that god and they added it to their pantheon, and that's why we still have the word Thames as our river, the river I live next door to, which is actually a very ancient word and is pre-Roman. Now, I wanted to go on now to the Numa of Rome, Numa. According to tradition, Numa Pompilius, who's a Sabine, was the second king of Rome. And he looked a lot like, by the way, Quirinius, the person I just mentioned, the Oak King. And it was he who founded the Roman religion. Now, Numa, was believed to have had a direct and personal relationship with a number of deities. But most famously, the deity he's most closely connected with is a water nymph named Egeria, who became not only his female advisor and his counsellor, but also his divine consort. Egeria was a very ancient goddess. She came from a sacred forest and is probably connected with, in fact, she may even be the same person as Diana of the Wood, who was a huntress goddess that had been worshipped for years and was normally portrayed surrounded by oak nymphs. So you can see now why I say that Numa Pompilius is a similar kind of person to the Oak King. Now, King Numa, who was a human, not a god, died in 673, although, as I've just told you, he was attached to the water nymph Egeria. And according to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a historical document, upon Numa's death, the nymph Egeria melted into tears of sorrow, and thus she became a holy spring. And traditionally, this holy spring was found at the Porta Capena, the main entrance to the city of Rome on the Appian Way. But for us to discuss the founding of Rome properly, we have to go back a little bit further. And you've already heard me talk about Romulus, and you most likely have heard of Romulus and Remus. This is not the planets in Star Trek, by the way. This is two characters, and we haven't covered them yet, so let's delve into the Romulus and Remus myth now. So the tradition of Romulus and Remus incorporates elements of folklore, and like many of the subjects that I've covered in this show up till now, it's not clear how much of it is historical fact and how much of it is totally mythological. But the story goes that Romulus had a twin brother, Remus, and they were the sons of a princess. And in some accounts, this princess was a virgin, but was impregnated by the god Mars. The product of that impregnation was Romulus and Remus. That may well be apocryphal, but their grandfather, who was a human, was a Trojan, and thus they did come from heroic descent. After a bit of political skullduggery and screaming that I won't bore you with right now, it was ordered that the two twins should be thrown into the rain-swollen river Tiber so that neither would ever inherit the throne. But instead of carrying out the orders that they were given, the servants left the baby twins along the riverbank by the foot of the Palatine Hill. Now, the legend goes that a she-wolf happened upon these tiny twins, and she suckled them and she tended to them in a cave until they were found by a local herdsman. And thus they were feral children, like Mowgli in Jungle Book, feral, F-E-R-A-L children. Anyway, when these princes grew up, they regained their claim to the royal blood, and they set out to establish a city of their own. They returned to the hills overlooking the Tiber, the hills where they were saved by the wolf mother, and they were raised by the herdsman, but they could not agree on which hill they should establish their new city. When an omen to resolve the controversy failed to provide any clear indication, the conflict between them escalated, and perhaps accidentally, we don't ever know, but perhaps accidentally, Romulus killed Remus, his brother. So through this homicidal act, Romulus won the right to establish the city and give it his name, and that's why it's called Rome. And after a ritual sacrifice, he laid out the city's boundaries using a ploughed furrow, and then he performed another sacrifice. Then he asked his followers to start building the new city. And Romulus apparently chose 100 men from the leading families to establish the first Roman Senate. These leading men he called Patres, the city fathers, and their descendants became known as the patricians, one of the two major social classes of Rome. The other social class was the plebs, or the plebeians, and this consisted of servants, freedmen, fugitives who'd sought asylum in Rome, men captured in war, and others who were granted Roman citizenship over time. And that's how the ancient Roman Republic began, the founding of Rome through myth and magic. Finding your fantasy character. So continuing on my 90 days of fantasy fiction and my tips for writing your first fantasy novel, and following on from last week when I looked at 7 fantasy plot lines and discussed and compared the difference between a plotter and a pantser, and also following on from episode 1 of this year, which was thinking about the theme, your big idea for your fantasy fiction project. This week I wanted to talk about finding your fantasy character. Now, each story has a main character that the book revolves around. He or she or the it or the hero or heroine is also known in posh circles as the protagonist. But we like to use the word main character or MC. It's perhaps important to point out at an early stage that just because we use the word hero when we describe a main character, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do anything particularly heroic within the story to get the honour of being defined as a hero. Now, they probably will do something heroic because, after all, you're writing fantasy fiction here, but we call them a hero, even though they're just the main character, because they give themselves up to scrutiny. They might even put their life at risk for our benefit. They will give themselves up for the benefit of the reader's entertainment. Before we get into the antagonistic types, that's the baddies, the bad characters, let's first think about the motivations and conflicts that might be found within your main character. Now, you know your theme and your plot type already because you've been following the 90 Days of Fantasy Fiction tips. And you'll have prepared those already. So now you'll be in a position to answer the following 4 questions. Aim. What does your main character most want to accomplish? Write the answer down. Effort. What effort will be required to accomplish that goal? You may not be able to write the answer to that just yet, but think about it. Impediments. What internal impediment might stop him or her successfully accomplishing their goal? And updates required, just like a application on your smartphone, what updates or improvements or upgrades will the hero need to accomplish his or her success? So you'll see, like any human, your hero will be driven. For example, just any human will be driven to get a better job, or pass an exam, or learn to drive, or save enough money to buy a car, or get a rewarding part-time job, or get a stable relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or earn enough money to buy a flat, or be brave enough and strong enough to fight a horde of raging dragons. But let's face it, the internal motivations, those things that any human, including your hero, wants to do, will face limits. So, for example, we can't do all things we want to do at once. We have to do things in a certain sequence in order to progress to our main goal. So, for example, your hero can't run before he can walk. Just like you, if he wants a better job, he must pass an exam. If he wants to pass an exam, he will have to study. If he wants to study at college, he will need a car perhaps to get there. If he wants a car, he'll need some other income, and so on. Each small victory comes with its own subset of objectives, failures, frustrations, deficiencies, and, hopefully, wins. If the hero triumphs over all these little insignificant feats, and each one is completed in the short term, and in the right order, in the right sequence, then he will gradually approach the main objective, properly armed and ready to face the final battle. So, for example, Harry Potter doesn't fight Voldemort in a climactic scene right at the very start of the series. Actually, maybe he does. But anyway, let's leave that for a moment. Harry has to start in school. He has to make it through his first year as a new student. He has to learn wizardry, and he finds he's a bit crap at things to start with. He has to make friends with people he has very little in common with. He has to pass tests in subjects that he doesn't much like. He has to do all of these things just so he could advance to the next level. His life is like a 1980s platform game. And in my opinion, this is Rowling's main influence, by the way, but that's for another time. Because Harry tries, he so often tries, and he fails, he so often fails, to get towards that end-of-level boss confrontation that he's always wanting to get to, but he's never quite ready to achieve. So in other words, Harry has to learn all the little things before he becomes good enough to do the big things. He has to do the little things in sequence before he can face the end-of-level boss and become the bigger-than-big hero that he will eventually become. If you don't like Harry Potter, what about the boyish Arya Stark? Just think about all the little things she has to learn, all the general crap she has to go through on almost a daily basis just to become a main character in the Game of Thrones. Now, I know what you'll be saying at this stage. You'll be saying, I'm not bloody writing Bridget Jones' Diary. I'm writing a fantasy novel here. I don't want my main druid or my main succubus or my necromancer to learn to drive and go to college to get a diploma. No, I know that. I know you want your druid to master the mysteries of death itself. I know you want your succubus to devour a king. I know you want your adventuress to ride a sea-goat into the teeth of hell, or your necromancer to overcome the final dungeon master. I know all that, but you have to go back to the 4 original questions about your accomplishment. And if you've forgotten them, then it's the ones which start with what does your main character most want to accomplish. Now, if you were writing those 4 questions for Harry Potter, you might say this. Objective. To discover what happened to his parents and get revenge on the perpetrator. Effort. To learn enough magical power to face his opponent as a realistic contender. Impediments. Well, his fallibility, his lack of knowledge, and his occasional bouts of folly. And his upgrades that are required. Yeah, he needs to master wizardly arts, he needs to have knowledge and experience of life, and he needs to learn self-control. Let's move to the antagonist, the baddie character. Now, often an antagonist is viewed as the polar opposite of a hero, but this is not always the case. It's more important that the antagonist in every situation is the person who stops or hinders the hero's success. Now, Lord Voldemort is the very essence of an antagonist, and in fact, Harry's chance of living depends on him defeating the antagonists. But that doesn't always have to be the case. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you need to write a truly villainous baddie character. Your antagonist does not have to be a Voldemort to your Harry, or Dracula to your Van Helsing, or Darth Vader to your Skywalker. All I'm saying is that your antagonist doesn't have to be stereotypically bad. They don't even have to be bad at all, actually. Their primary role is to hinder the hero, to complicate matters, and to frustrate your hero's best intentions. So, imagine the hero must pass an exam, but his friend tries to talk him out of it. Or he must buy a car, but his parents stand in his way. Or he wants to form a steady relationship with a new person he's met, but his ex has other ideas. Now, all these people, and perhaps they're all rolled into one, or they're 3 separate people, all these people are his antagonists. And the reason they are is because they antagonise him, because they complicate matters and they frustrate his intentions. They hinder him whilst he's on his path to get in towards the big boss at the end. In fact, they might even stop him accomplishing his goal altogether. If one of those things in sequence is taken out, then he won't be able to reach his goal. Yet they don't even think of themselves as antagonists. They're not necessarily bad people, are they? His friend, for example, might have the best of intentions when he tries to talk him out of passing an exam. His parents know what's best for him, and that's why they don't want him to get a car. And his ex might guess that he's not ready to go into a serious relationship yet, and that's why he shouldn't start trying to get one. See, they're not bad people, but they are antagonistic. They don't even know they're being bad, but they are antagonistic. They're antagonistic because they're complicating matters and frustrating his intentions. Now I've said that to you, it makes it, I hope, a little bit easier to write your antagonist characters. You don't need one big Voldemort or one big Darth Vader. It's possible you need 2 or 3 smaller, more irritating characters, the type of person who will stand in your hero's way. And also, your antagonist doesn't have to be unimprovable. In fact, they'd be more interesting if they could somehow and some way get around to seeing the hero's point of view. In fact, what's interesting about my list of really, really bad antagonists that I've just given you, Voldemort, Darth Vader, Dracula, is that they all share a odd connection with the hero, don't they? Yes, they might be opposite the hero in many ways, but just like a reflection in the mirror, there's something quite disconcerting and disquieting about the hero and the antagonist and their many similarities. You know, how much teenagers dislike their parents, and yet they're part of their parents. They belong to their parents, and they often reflect their parents. Maybe that's what they don't like about the relationship. Anyway, well, whilst we're on the subject of writing a proper villainous baddie, I just wanted to mention that the antagonist doesn't have to try to kill your hero in every chapter. And I like to stress that the job of an antagonist is merely to complicate matters, to stand in the way of the character, to push the hero down, to obstruct the progress of the hero and generally degrade the resolution of the hero so that he might eventually give up on his main quest. And now I want to turn to something that I call kinetic potential. Kinetic potential. How much kinetic potential, trademark pending, kinpot, does your hero possess? Will there be enough propellant in his or her jetpack to push them all the way to the end of the book? And hopefully into further exploits when you write your next episode in the must-read box set. Kinetic potential is all about exploiting your protagonist's weakness rather than his or her strengths. So, when Jerry Siegel wrote about Superman, he knew that his story's greatest flaw was that his hero was totally unstoppable and totally unchallengeable. In fact, Superman is godlike, and who wants a hero that can overcome every single obstacle he comes across without any effort? What's the fun in that? Scenes would be fairly dull, wouldn't they, if you already knew from the outset that Superman will win, because he always wins. And worse still, the reader would soon become bored with a godlike character with whom he has no recognisable and relatable characteristics that they share. For example, Superman, the godlike character that was first conceived of by Jerry Siegel, isn't fallible like we are, so there's nothing to identify with. So Jerry Siegel loaded his divine protagonist with a lot of imperfections, such as a pleasant credulity, some shyness, and a sad backstory about him being an orphan. He also created a blind spot that might give his main enemy an advantage, and that blind spot is kryptonite. So, like I already said, the key to kinetic potential for your story is the weakness of your protagonist. So, list the weaknesses of your protagonist. Take them one by one, and then deal with them. In that way, you can be sure that we will have enough episodes in your story to power you through 85,000 words and beyond. So we've already talked about Harry Potter's weaknesses, about the fact that he was inclined to be rash about things. He didn't know his wizardly skills to start with. He had difficulty making friends to start with. So those are the weaknesses that we can use to give this character and this whole story kinetic potential. And it will also provide something that your human audience can get their teeth into, because it's something that's relatable to any human. Because flawed characters are human characters, and humans will be reading your book. So, basically what I'm saying here is, don't write your protagonist too flat. Make sure that he or she or it has roundness, has vulnerability, and has imperfections. And work these out at an early stage. Write them down now. Don't wait until you're third way through the book before you make your protagonist identifiable by giving him diagnosable flaws and ailments. Now, I use all the time a book called The Negative Trait Thesaurus, which is by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. This thesaurus gives a stack of flaws, and with their diagnosis and cures too. And I suggest you get yourself a copy of that and flesh out your hero by giving him or her or it a couple of juicy negative traits. Flicking through the thesaurus right now, I've found some that may well fit the Harry Potter character. I've found impatient in the dictionary, impulsive in the dictionary, and reckless in the dictionary. And there's probably some more. And when you look at those headings, impatient, impulsive, reckless, it gives you a whole list of things that the character will be seen to do. And it gives you a whole load of diagnosis and cure too. So it's very, very useful dictionary. I'll put a link to it on my show notes. And what about positive traits, I hear you ask? Well, do you need me to give your hero some positivity? I hope not. But while we're on the subject, those two people I mentioned, Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi, have also written a positive trait thesaurus, and it's also called A Writer's Guide to Character Attributes, if you get stuck. I'll put a link on that as well. I've got that book. I don't use it as much as the Negative Traits book, but it's a useful book to have. And going back a little bit to antagonist, why not give your antagonist some positive traits too? Remember I said he doesn't have to be all bad or even half bad. He could even be, the antagonist characters could even be friends. And they could even be likeable. And to make your antagonists more compelling and to create a truly three-dimensional anti-hero, as well as a three-dimensional hero, why not give your anti-hero some positive traits? So, for example, Lord Voldemort, you might think is all bad, but he makes a very charismatic leader. And Darth Vader, you might think is all bad, but he's a great pilot and he's probably a very organised manager. And you might think that Dracula is all bad, but he's very attentive and he's also very passionate. Hopefully these ideas on finding your fantasy character will help you with your first fantasy novel. And follow my advice on 90 Days of Fantasy Fiction, because next week I'll be talking about the next stage of your writing process, which is the point of view. Good luck with your first fantasy novel. Good luck with your 90 Days of Fiction. Keep listening to Myth and Magic, and I'll see you soon.